Hello there. You're listening to 10 Questions, where we discuss the wet plate collodion process and the photographers that create these unique images known as ambrotypes and tintypes. I'm your host, Chad Shryock, wet plate photographer for Pork Pie Photography based in Fort Collins, Colorado. In each episode, I've asked a modern-day practitioner to sit down with me and talk about how they got involved with this vintage process, share some information on their gear and studio, and provide some valuable insights into their creative process. So whether you're just beginning to dabble your toes in the collodion ethers, or you're a seasoned silverbath expert, hang on and see what develops with 10 Questions. During the history of wet plate photography, there have been many different folks involved with this craft. Innovators, explorers, historians, memory catchers, artists, and others. In this episode, I want to talk about someone that was a bit of a combination of all of these. In the early days of photography, the idea of the post-mortem photograph was developed as a way to capture that final image that would be a memento of a person that was no longer with us, but one that we could always look back on. My goal with this episode's guest was to make others aware of one of our own who is no longer with us and celebrate his legacy. So welcome wet plate enthusiasts to a different type of episode for 10 Questions. Today we embark on a journey to rediscover the work and life of a remarkable artist, a photographer who left an undeniable mark in the collodion world. His name was Will Dunniway, and his story is one of dedication, passion, and a profound impact within the wet plate community. And though he may no longer be with us, Will's influence continues to inspire generations of photographers. In this special episode, we'll delve into the life and legacy of Will through the voices of those who knew him best, family, friends, and students who were deeply touched by his artistry and vision. And through their firsthand accounts, we'll not only explore what motivated Will to get into this photographic process, but we'll also gain a deeper understanding of the individual behind the lens. I've reached out to contemporaries such as Bob Szabo, Lisa Dodge, Ian Reuter, Conrad Young, and even John Coffer. But most of his story is told by his wife who supported him in his endeavors, Dr. Fran Dunniway. So sit back, relax, and prepare to be captivated by the story of a truly remarkable photographer whose legacy deserves to be celebrated. So today on 10 Questions, I would like to welcome a special guest to the program, Dr. Frances Dunniway. Hi, Fran. Thanks for being on the podcast today, and thanks for signing up to talk about Will Dunniway.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, Fran, tell me, when did you first meet Will?
I met Will in October of 1995, and I remember exact because I was married previous, and we were doing Civil War reenacting as a family, and were invited to participate in the Kearney Park Civil War reenactment, which is held in Kearney Park, Fresno, California, in or about the month of October, beginning or end. And my husband at the time had a horse, so he found this photographer who could take an image on a piece of tin.
Okay. Now, had you ever heard anything about tintype photography before that event?
I had never heard anything about Civil War before then, other than what I learned in high school and junior high study.
Okay. All right. Now, did you grow up in California as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Born in Oregon, raised until first grade in Seattle, Washington, and moved to California about halfway through my first grade year and have lived the rest of my life here.
Got it. So around 1995, Will had been shooting collodion at least for some time at that point, correct?
Yeah, I think if we do the years, it was at least 15, 20 years by then. I believe it was the 125th reenactment of the Battle of Gettysburg, where Will met John Coffer. And that's where he first saw the process being done at the Gettysburg reenactment, of course, in Pennsylvania.
Right.
And then he came back and it captured his interest significantly, where he wrote back and forth letters to John Coffer. So that's how he was taught collodion wet plate.
To learn more about how Will got involved with collodion, I reached out to John Coffer and Ian Reuter to talk about Will's love of reenactment and how it turned into a yearning to get into collodion.
I met Will at the 1988 Gettysburg 125th reenactment when Claude and I were set up there, the only people doing wet plate. And Will was just one of the reenactors that, I guess he was a Confederate sergeant at the time, and as a reenactor. We had you wouldn't believe the lines of people waiting. They would roll up in their blankets and sleep in line so they could be, get a chance at us the next day, getting the portrait. I don't know if Will actually did that or not, but he was so, happy that he finally got to us, and I did a nice amber type portrait of him in a case, and original case, and that inspired him. He, I guess he went home and said, "Man, I want to know how to do this." So he wrote me, and I said, "Sure, we could work something out. I could teach you how to do the process," because he wanted to switch to that rather than being a soldier and be a photographer. The reenactments that they're having out west, and that there are lots of Old West events too out west that he wanted to be at. Anyway, so made arrangements with them, and I actually sold him his first wet plate camera, which was an original 1870s, what they call the Victoria camera. I had a 4-tube lens set on it, as well as it came with a single lens Dalmar lens that I had on it. So he got his first camera from me, and I took the train out to California with my stuff and set up in my sister's front yard. There was Southern California where she was living at the time, and Will came and a couple of reenactor buddies, and we shot plates, and I got him fully initiated in it.
He was doing a lot of reenactment work, and he was doing it in the field, and to me that's so commendable. I think that's why his knowledge was so great, and I think that's a lost thing. And then I think in the wet plate world that he did do that to make money along with workshops, but he was also an incredible artist within that, and I don't think it reached its full potential. I don't think the light shined on him as much as it should have.
So Will's introduction to wet plate really started as a result of his love of history.
That is correct.
So what was it about history that he was so fascinated with? I mean, was this something that maybe as an adult he got into, or was it something that started as a child? What was his fascination?
The first story he ever talked about with antiques and old stuff was when he was in junior high, I believe. He went into an antique store owned by one of his classmates' mother, and he found a book on photography amongst all of the other old stuff. And he just fell in love with the way the photographs just came off the page. And he said there was just something that happened there. And of course, he's always loved military history, was an avid historian in that as well. And so this just captured him with his love of photography as well as history. So seeing these images as a child and then suddenly seeing somebody as an adult many years later who's making the same images, he always said he couldn't stop until he learned it.
Yeah,
He
that's
said
great.
he was always born in the wrong century. He felt he should have been born in the 19th century.
How long had Will been into Civil War reenacting prior to actually seeing the process? I would assume that there were a few folks during that time, especially in the reenactment kind of camps that were doing tintype photography, but there probably still weren't very many. So I would assume that depending on like which part of the country you're in, you may not get the chance to see a real life tintype photographer.
At the time he learned it, there were none on the West Coast. He met Claude Levay and John Coffer, of course, on the East Coast as an adult, probably, I want to say probably in his late 30s or 40s. He started, I think it was in his 30s, because he was part of the artillery brigade at one of the Civil War groups called NCWA. And that was part of a group of folks that went all the way from Oregon and Washington and mostly in Northern California. And they put on 8 to 10 reenactments a year. At that point, he was black and white photographer, or at the time it was film and digital. I don't think digital had quite started yet. But he took a lot of images just to make sure capturing the events, but he was part of the artillery crew. So he would roll out the cannons. They often did demonstrations at Monterey Bay, where they had on Memorial Day, they always did the parade dressed in their regalia suits, and then they would culminate at the edge of the wharf and blow off the cannons and amaze the crowds. He liked the bringing real history to life. He was fanatic about making sure that the buttons were correct and the costuming and the clothing were period perfect. He made sure he wore the weird glasses, which I think he's most famous for. Everybody knew Will Dunniway wore the old spectacles. And he just was doing that probably close to 10 years before he ran into John Coffer. And it just clicked. He just felt he was too old to keep running up and down a battlefield, and now he had something he could switch over to.
So he must have been pretty invested in the reenactment front to go from California all the way to Gettysburg to attend, one of the major events out there.
Very much so. He was also in the Dances with Wolves. He was the first sergeant, just right out of the camera's view of him making it onto the big screen. So he was part of the reenactment group that donated their time to go and make that movie period correct. It was very, very important to him that history represent the goodness of the men that he was representing, and never wanted to dishonor any of their memories. That's why he was so true to it.
That's great. So let's talk a little bit about his learning experience then. So for folks that are familiar with John Coffer, everyone knows that the best way to get a hold of John is to write him a letter. So it sounds like that's what Will did to try and figure out how to do collodion. What was that process for him, as Will was trying to learn? How long did it take him? What was kind of his early experience with the process?
Recalling stories, Will said the first 2 years were catastrophic. He wrote to John a letter that I will call you at the local drugstore at 12 noon on a Wednesday. And then Will would make a phone call to that payphone, and John would pick up and they would speak on the phone. And so Will learned over a period of many months. He would send John another letter. He would take images of what he made, and then he would say, these are the latest pictures that I made, because Will was an art director at Mount Hermon Christian Conference Center. So Will had access to printing the images that he made, making photocopies, sending them to John and say, help, look at this catastrophic. What are these lines? What are these marks? What are these blotches? And so then John would critique his work and tell him exactly what he did. And Will would write just detailed notes on these horrific images of what John said. I have 40 years worth of letters between John and Will Dunniway.
That's great.
And of course, John always wrote on the back of whatever paper he had. So I'll have like a grocery, flyer on one side, and I've got a handwritten note from John to Will on the other side, always talking about collodion. And then, of course, over the years, they became much more personal letters.
John recalls these letters and the pre-scheduled phone booth conversations.
After I got home, we would write a lot, back and forth. Or another thing that was kind of funny at the time, there was a payphone at Dundee, and Will would give me a time.
Okay.
Call me at 1:00, such and such day. And so I'd go to town on my horse and buggy or ride my bike and get on the payphone and call him. And he, catch up on things. And if he had any questions about, the process, new things he's come on or whatever.
So after Will's experience, seeing that process from John early on during the reenactment days, how long did it take for Will to actually go out and meet the two of those guys together and just sit down and talk about collodion?
I know Will went back to, John had that event every year.
Right. Camp Tintype, right?
Camp Tintype. And Will went back several times before I met him. And my understanding is Will was making images within that first year. He was already making images, not very good ones, but he was making them. I had a collection of Will's glass negatives starting in about 97. These were all glass negatives of reenactors. I had just boxes after he passed of glass negatives of these reenactments, and beautiful stuff. So he was very, very good even by the mid-90s, 95, 96, 97.
But yeah, Will did the reenactments. He did ferrotypes only, as well as ammotypes at the reenactments out west there, and he was really into it. He did some really good work. I have his book. He published a book, the kind of his bio and everything to do with his life as a wet plate photographer. I mean, he really, life started with wet plate for Will. I feel like he really loved it, and that became his identity till the day he died. The wet plate guy, the tintype guy. So, that gives as a mentor, it makes you feel good that you changed somebody's life, And it sounds like I'm bragging, but maybe I am, But yeah, we had a strong relationship, Will and I, and he got really really good friends with Claude too, who had been my apprentice. And so he would come out and visit every so often, drop in and visit him and Claude and whatever, and I'd shoot wet plate, and he'd been to the jamboree. Claude and Will both came to several jamborees. So yeah, I miss them. I miss them both, a lot.
So after Will had learned the process, he's out shooting. You guys are in beautiful California where there's just immense amounts of nature around. Will has very much frequented Yosemite and some of the other national parks there and other areas. What was it about landscape photography that Will was so enamored with?
Will was fascinated by Muybridge and Carlton Watkins, and loved the fact that the national parks were developed and founded because of the collodion wet plate. And had these photographers in the 19th century not made the mule train wagons to capture our cliffs in Yosemite, then we wouldn't have these national parks today. So again, that history and the magic of this photographic process is what stabilized the world to see these incredible areas. Will started photographing Yosemite just with his regular camera, and he always called Columbia, California, his second home. They did Gold Rush reenactments up there, which of course is an earlier period with the same photographic process. And so throughout California history, he would do that as well. But the Yosemite in collodion started in about 2002 is when I see some of his earliest work of landscapes. And that was with Wayne Pierce and Bob Szabo.
So, Bob, Fran was telling me that you and Will used to go on what you would call an expedition out at Yosemite in kind of the early 2000s. What kind of work were you guys doing there?
Well, it was varied. I think it was 2002 when we first went. There was a couple things that we did there. I think I came up with the idea of going, and the reason was the Carlton Watkins exhibit, and it went around the country, and it happened to be in D.C. where I worked, and it was nothing but his mammoth plate stuff, and it just amazed me, especially the Yosemite pictures. So I got a hold of Will, and we planned a trip out there, and it was just to shoot wet plate. There was no real like we're going to make sure this happens and do this or that. So, and the other thing that tied into that though, we did a demonstration in Wawona for a school group, a bunch of kids, and I still have pictures from that where we were there and showing them how it worked. We took pictures. It was actually me, Will, and Wayne Pierce, who was another friend. That's what we did when we were there. But I shot 5x8. A little bit of, I think half plate 5x8. I might have shot a couple 8x10s, and Will was shooting pretty much the same, but maybe a lot of 5x7s. And we were just out there to shoot different locations. And I was extremely interested in getting shots from exact locations that Watkins did, just because I wanted to see what they would look like. Yeah, Will was a good friend. He was always a good host. I loved going out there and spending time with him, staying at his house with him, making the trips. When he lived in the Redwoods, anyhow, it was the most windy road going down there. He would drive down and I'd get car sick going all the way down the hill. But like I said, Will was a great guy, and he helped me a lot when I got started. I'd call him all the time. And we must have talked for a couple of years, I think. Well, yeah, it was. I started in 97, and I got together with him in 2002, and that might have been the first time I saw him in person. Yeah, I think it might have been. So actually, refresh my memory. When was 9/11? When did that happen? Because we got together then because he was here.
That back in 2001, right?
So that might have been the first time I met him face to face. He actually came and clawed the way to my house and Wayne Pierce, and they stayed at my house in Hume. So, but before that, I have been talking to him for 3 years, like all the time on the phone. We were really good friends before we even met face to face.
And he would take these expeditions, as he'd call them, and he would go out in the snow and the sleet, and they would make these images. And then he would write like a detailed diary of how he captured the images, what troubles he had, what problems he had, what he learned from what he did. And it was always so that the next guy coming behind him to shoot Yosemite didn't do the same mistakes.
Yeah, that's great. That's one of the things that I want to get into and talk about a little bit was, not only was Will a fantastic photographer, but he was not a person to kind of hold secrets from other people, right? He seemed like he very much had a teaching spirit to him, that he wanted to go out and share this process with others and enable other people to go out and make the same types of photographs and images that he was able to create. To get a better feel for how Will was as a collodion teacher, I thought what better way to find out than to reach out to a couple of his past students. So I tracked down Ian Reuter, Lisa Dodge, and Conrad Young to get their thoughts.
I met Will. It's probably been close to 15 years now. I had an idea that I was gonna make a camera. I was gonna make a delivery truck into a camera and do the wet plate process. And I figured, I need to learn wet plate to start. So I was living in LA, and he was pretty close. So I just signed up with him. I didn't know him, for a workshop, and that's how I met him. As a teacher, I mean, I remember him teaching the process, and then I was in his studio and I could see some of his work, and see the lenses, and he was a really good teacher. And I remember after the workshop, I mean, the first thing I said to him, I sat down on his couch at his house and I was like, thank you so much for sharing this with me. You literally just changed my life. That impactful. I was like, this is incredible. And mind you, I'd already been working as a photographer for 10 years prior. I did it all. I did commercial photography and whatever comes with that. And him teaching me that changed my entire life.
Well, I was studying art at college probably, I guess, about 16 years ago now. And I had a history of photography class, and I fell in love with everything pre 1900. Everything after that, I did nothing for me. So I was horrible at writing papers, and I convinced my teacher to let me go through the process, do a test run, and then present that to the class instead. So in lieu of writing the paper, she said, okay, if I had a different presentation, and being a very tactile person, this worked well for me. So going forward, I found the photography room and made some glass plates, very amateur, very, by the seat of my pants, and came back and presented that to the class. While doing that, it was very sculptural for me in the photography realm, not like digital, and it just had a feeling to it, like you were sculpting at the same time that you were photographing. And it just spoke to my heart. So I did some research, and I found a wet plate artist down in Corona named Will Dunniway, and I contacted him. And I told him that I was eager to learn the process, and he had a couple of workshops coming up. And I said, great, sign me up. And it's just like, when you find something that you think you really, really want to do and you can't wait to try it, he just brushed me off. He's like, sorry, class is closed, class is closed. I go, what do you mean? I need to do this now. I can't wait till April or August or the next class. I need it now. And he's like, sorry. Well, little known to me, my husband had called Will Dunniway as well and said, I would like to gift this to Lisa for Christmas. So they were in cahoots with each other, and he was all stern on the phone saying, no, Lisa, you can't. You're going to have to wait maybe a year. And I'm like, oh my goodness. So I'm trying to find other teachers. Nobody really matched up with what he was on the phone and what he sounded like. Anyway, Christmas came, and all the gifts are open, and there's one little envelope on the tree, and I opened it up, and it was a gift certificate to one of his workshops. And I remember just like the tears coming down with excitement of, wow, I finally get to do this. And so then when I finally went to the class and met Will and all his cronies and his people, I just felt like they were my tribe. And he laughed and giggled like this is sort of a bigger guy, with that sort of Santa Claus love, and we got you good, kid. And we started the class. And from the first moment that I smelled that ether, I just knew, I felt like I was home again, if you believe in that sort of thing. And the passion went on from there.
The first time I met Will Dunniway, we were talking on the phone. I had been looking for a way to learn wet plate. My buddy had just dropped off a bunch of gear and went down to Central America. And a bunch of chemistry just sat around for couple years, and I didn't know what to do with it. I would look at it and wonder, how do I make it? What do I do? And I started looking online, and I found Will's website. And I remember 5 years earlier that I had seen his website. And so I reached out to him on the phone and started talking to him very cordially. And he told me the prices for a wet plate workshop. I'm like, well, Will, I can't afford that, but is there any other way like we can do it? And he's like, well, if you find 6 people, the price will drop down to $600.
Okay.
So
That's right. You became his marketing guy there for a little while, right?
Yeah. So anyway, I started calling all my friends. None of them answered and wanted to learn wet plate. So I came back to him and said, hey, let me get everyone who ever said no. And I got that list, and within 2 days, I had 6 people signed up. And one of them was Ann Riviera, now Ann Jones, who is a cup full of sunshine on Instagram. And her and I took the course together, and, we're still going strong 9 years later. And this was Will's first class that he taught, or first workshop, since he had his heart attack. So it was kind of like there was a lot going on, from just that day. And when I pulled up to his house, which was pretty cool, his whole entire garage was, half of it was a dark room, half of it was a work station that had he would cutting mats, printing, doing all that, like a dry dark room area.
Yep.
And then we did the workshop in there, and then we're doing portraits out in his backyard. And he taught us how to do natural light portraits because he says that God's light was the only way that collodion ever looked good. And for years, he and I would argue about that, and then one day I took a little humble pie and started shooting natural light again instead of strobes. And he looked at me and goes, yeah, you're doing the right thing. Strobe, God's light's always better. It was a pretty fun workshop. It was a 2-day thing. And at the end, he goes, if you ever need help, I'm always here. And so I got home, and within a month I had a destroyed silver bath, and none of my pictures were coming out. And I called him up again, and he said, come on up. And we cleaned my silver. He taught me some more. And then we started talking a lot or a lot more. And over time, friendships were created. And then if Will really liked you, he called you his pard, like, hey, like a partner, like pardner, so pard was his way of expressing like you're in.
Yeah.
And, he had his group of people that he really liked, it's just like a hodgepodge group of just ruffians, fun people, just interesting people in this artwork, the world, the collodion, and people who really enjoyed it, and I'd always sit up there with them and talk to them, send them, hey, what am I doing here? So the first year was just like everyone who's starting out with collodion, just like, oh my gosh, what am I doing wrong? Like on the phone one day, he goes, Conrad, right now I'm going to call you the king of crud because everything's coming out cruddy. I'm like, all right, fine. So I got that nickname for, 6 months. And every time I'd call him, he's like, what's up, king of crud? I'm like, oh, dude, come on, Will, it ain't that bad. He's like, and then one day he looked at me and goes, I can't call you the king of crud anymore. You've graduated. Now you're doing good work. I'm proud of you. And it was that was one of those moments that I was like, okay, I'm feeling good about myself. My mentors likes what I'm doing, and it's no longer just the beginning stages. It's no longer the apprentice stages. That's when I kind of felt I had stepped out of an apprentice moment into on the road of a journeyman.
What was it about Will's teaching style that you remember the most?
He was an extremely humble man who had a great attention to detail and the historic process of it, and held on to that to a T, almost as if he was walking you through with, one of the first wet plate people. And I mean, everything down to the equipment, the chemistry, the equipment being used to mix it was all just like the 1800s. It was very pure and true. And this I liked.
Yeah. And you are still a wet plate photographer today, correct?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
It's been 15 years now. And I attune my craftsmanship to being taught by Will Dunniway. I would not be as good at my craft if I was not taught by him, for sure.
He always wanted the legacy of the process to last. And that was why he was so diligent to write what he did and when he did it and what mistakes he made. He would be on the phone after a catastrophic event, and we had catastrophic events even up until, before he had his first heart attack. We had a horrific event up in the high desert where there was sand and heat, and we couldn't keep the bath under 90 degrees, our silver bath, and it was every form of catastrophic. And all Will could think of when he got home was photographing every one of these plates, putting it out there on the website to let everybody know, don't get into the sand, make sure your bath stays, closer to 70 degrees, I think it was. This is how we did it. We had an ice pack, we did, and he wrote down and he showed every single person on this expedition journey all of these catastrophic details of his mistakes. It was always about making sure that the next guy was able to get a perfect shoot.
So as I was getting the camera truck going and I kind of got it going, I was talking to Will about this place in the southern Sierras. It's called the Alabama Hills. And I'm like, have you ever been there? And he's like, yeah, I know about it. And we got talking. He's like, I should do a workshop there. And I was like, if you do that, I can come down and meet you. And I just really had got the camera truck going and I drove down and I was down there a day early and he was down there a day early setting up, and I tried to make a plate and it didn't work. And I mean, I had a huge meltdown and I was almost in tears. And then he came up and he's all in Will, in his, I don't know if you know his voice, but it's pretty deep. And he's all, well, Ian, and he was checking it out, and he just came and looked at it, looked at two, three things, and he's like, it's this, that, you need to do this. And I was just so blown away by all of his knowledge. And then the next day, I didn't even want to. I just needed to filter my silver and clean it, but I was so new to it that I didn't know. But the next day, I didn't even shoot with the camera truck. I just stopped doing what I was doing, and we just watched him, and I just watched him work and how he did it, and it was really incredible at that too. So yeah.
What would Will say was his favorite subject to photograph?
Yosemite.
Yosemite.
It was the magical place. He said, all I am is a pirate who is capturing God's majesty. I am master of the art of fake. That's how he called himself. That all he is doing is capturing the beauty of God's world. And he wanted that world known. He wanted people to see what God gave him. And he cherished every single day on earth.
That's great. It's amazing that he had the ability to go out and fulfill that passion, to share that with others in that way.
We did. We had an opportunity of shooting arches with a Native American tour guide. He took 4 of us around, so we were able to capture arches. We were able to do the northern end of Grand Canyon, the Colorado end. We were able to do the south rim of the Grand Canyon. We had the opportunity of doing the desert scapes and just had opportunities of doing all of these wonderful things. We had traveled to Zion to capture Zion. He was going around and doing the different national parks, and that was just part of it, was just making sure people knew these parks were out there and free of charge. You just had to show up.
I've had some guests on the show. In fact, it may have been Conrad Young that mentioned that he would love to go out and shoot all of the national parks. And I got to think that Will is probably a big inspiration behind that effort, because it sounds like he got
talked about that a lot.
it sounds like Will kind of kicked things off, and hopefully there are folks like Conrad and others out there that can kind of pick up that torch and carry that on to go out and capture wet plate images of what we have in our country, especially these beautiful parks.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Fran, in addition to being an extra in some movies, Will also had the opportunity to create some different props for some movies. Can you talk a little bit about some of the folks that Will had access to and some of the work that he did for Hollywood?
Only because it's history of, I found red ruby glass of Winona Ryder, and Will did those images in the movie Dracula.
Okay.
And had the opportunity of doing that. He also had whole plate cases that were used in different movies that he would loan these whole plate cases to Hollywood. Some of his cameras were loaned to Hollywood. He had the opportunity of working with Rob Kendrick at National Geographic. And that was the shoot where we went down to the museums in Los Angeles, the Museum of History, I think it was, where they took the penguin out of the defrost and they were able to capture that. There was the saber-toothed tiger that Rob Kendrick shot, that we did that for a whole day. Will had the opportunity of working with Ian Reuter on the shoot up in Mammoth, which was a commercial shoot. And Will was pouring all of the plates and doing all the darkroom work, and Ian was setting up this incredible process of flash photography using collodion.
Okay.
So he had an opportunity of helping all of these people sort of keep this process going. They use their names to, Rob got into National Geographic. He was a photographer there. Will and John and Mark Osterman helped Rob learn the process. Rob was then, of course, able to use his connections and do that cowboy shoot for National Geographic.
In the process of this one, I just came to my mind. In the process of me making the camera truck, I was doing commercial photography, and I worked for a snowboard company. At that time, I was staff for Burton Snowboards, and like only knowing wet plate for it seemed like a weekend, I pitched him a project that I was gonna shoot motion because that's what I was doing with wet plate, and then I got them to agree on this pretty large budget, and I asked Will. I said, "Hey, Will, will you come up and I wanna bring you on, and then you'll process the plates." And I thought that was really cool of him to agree to do that because he's way above me. So for him to almost be assisting me was really amazing. And I think he did stuff like that for me just to help me out. And I remember we were up there and we actually did it, and it was one of the more incredible things I've ever done. And I think he just got a kick out of it because all the younger snowboard kids, they called him Old Mountain Will, because he looked like a kind of old, like Snowshoe Thompson type of guy. It was really cool.
I wanted to ask about specifically those Winona Ryder images. I actually, so I have I guess kind of a geekiness for movie props, and a lot of it's Star Wars and science fiction and things like that. But I am familiar with a lot of the kind of the online forums and things where people buy and trade and sell these different movie props. And I was actually able to track down one of the folks that I think actually purchased these red amber type images of Winona Ryder. And I thought that was just pretty amazing that, maybe something that Will had done is now like a prized possession of this guy, and it's kind of the centerpiece of his, everything, all the other props that he has related to that movie. This is the one he was like super excited to get a hold of.
Yeah. I had a collodion gentleman who is assisting me in some of the higher end of Will's collection that I was never going to be able to find somebody who would be interested in a piece of red glass with Winona Ryder on it. That is not something I do in my professional, and I wanted to make sure, and I knew Will more than anything would want it to go to somebody who would cherish it and not necessarily bury it in a collection, but cherish it and love it. And hopefully whomever is now the owner of it loves it.
Yeah.
I don't know much about, I handed his collection over to a third-party person to help me sell them, who works for an auction house. So that was a friend in the collodion community who offered to assist me because I didn't want these things. We had the risk of fire 3 years ago up here, and all I could see was the art of Will Dunniway being destroyed in a fire. And that was sort of this jump start after he passed. That's all I could think about was, I can't let this stuff burn here.
Right.
And that was the jump start of how do I preserve what he did, his life's work, so that it doesn't burn up, literally.
Sure. So what are the plans? I mean, what would you like to see happen with Will's massive collection?
I have hundreds of glass negatives. I donated most all of his equipment to Fresno State University and to their Department of Photography, all different types of stuff, so that the students of photography continue the world of photography. And I had Will's students come up and, the cameras, of course, got sold to people that needed them. And the lenses went to people in good homes. And the chemicals, of course, went to people that could utilize them. I want to see Will's legacy last. I want people to know what a great person he was, but also the artist within him that was hidden from the public for the most part. He wasn't somebody who would promote his own work. He just wasn't. He was too humble.
So are there museums, different collection houses that you've spoken to that are willing to take on that kind of a collection, or what's...
Currently, they're all sitting in a safe.
Okay.
And I don't know what's going to happen to the glass negatives, honestly. They're one and done. I don't know what to do with them. I told you earlier about finding boxes of these Civil War soldiers and all of the reenactments. Another one of Will's friends, Richard Staley, who worked alongside of Will for 20 plus years in Kearney Park. And Richard helped me give these glass negatives away to the men that were inside them, the images were taken of. Now, is that what I should have done? It's what I felt I needed to do. I felt that these people would love their image and give their image to their grandchildren far better than me just storing them. I do know that Fort Tejon has taken some. I've got a contact at Kearney Park who has accepted and is going to receive some of the glass negatives. And again, it's just because it's either give them away or break them so that they're not sold as fake.
Right.
More than anything, Will never wanted anything plagiarized. He wanted nothing to be sold as an original that wasn't. So it was either give them to museums that I know would have the honest to either, put them up, or I had to break them. And I just couldn't bring myself to do that. I still can't.
Yeah.
So I have boxes of them. And I don't know that there's places that want glass negatives of essentially a Will Dunniway.
Well, I got to think that there's someone out there, and as you said, especially the folks that are actually in those images, that would be such a meaningful gift.
Yeah.
to be able to pass on to their family. But what an investigative effort to actually figure out who those folks are. Although you did say that Will was a tremendous note taker, so maybe he has all of those names available for each one of those images.
Well, I have the landscape images are landscapes. They're just glorious images. The images of the Civil War soldiers, I knew many of them. And we were able to get, I think I'm down to only, maybe 1 or 2 dozen of those left. The rest of them were fortunately, Richard was able to help me get them to the Columbia folks that were in them, to Kearney Park folks that were in them, to folks that did Fort Tejon reenacting. Unfortunately, some of the folks that were in the images have passed on. So it's getting them to the families and then having the families actually want them.
Yeah.
That's kind of the magic of the mixture. I gave 3 of the glass negatives of Yosemite to the Yosemite Railroad, and one of the folks Will had reenacted with for years is actually runs the railroad and does part of the history for them. So it's a way for his images to be held on display of the beautiful park, but also then people start asking questions, and then you get into the history of, well, Yosemite National Park was actually founded because of this process. So it's just an honor to have that history.
Did Will have a good way of tracking how many images and, how he took the photo and things like that? I mean, did he record that type of information for every single image that he took?
Interesting you ask, because Will put his glass negatives and then he always made a print copy within that glass negative, and on the back of the envelope he would write about 1 out of every 5 or 6 he would have, this was taken, it was a 3-second, it was taken with the Darlow, it was taken with the 3B, it was taken. So he would keep small notes for himself. Now, there weren't a lot of that on the Civil War guys. When I got involved with him, after we got married, I was sort of like the and company. He would not only day a full shoot of images for the day of the Civil War reenactment, but before he would deliver the image that had dried and been varnished and dried again, he would do a duplicate copy. And this was primarily because some of his original work that were started on tins were being plagiarized and sold to Europe as originals. And these images started to be sold, whether intentionally or accidentally. Will would sell them for $35 and he'd see them on eBay for $1,500. And so he would reach out and say, hey, that's a fake. I made it myself. And he just never wanted any of his work out there as without the integrity of when it was made. So he started making copies of everything, and I have digital backups of every single image he's ever made.
Well, that's fantastic. I hope you've got multiple copies of that, though.
There were 17 backup drives.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Will's teaching and actually sharing the process. When did he first get into sharing this in more of a classroom setting with students?
Wow. Okay. We had the house in Corona, and shortly after Will moved in, he started talking about wanting to teach classes in the garage. So we had our 3-car garage, 1-car area of it was turned into his walk-in darkroom. And at first he would have 2 or 3 students, and that took off. He was teaching then pretty regularly. Every month you'd have a couple of people. And this was a lot of people coming out of the LA area that, did the 1.5-hour drive and then would learn it. And then they wanted to come back and take more classes.
Yeah, I mean, well, it still started on that our first encounter because while I was sitting on his couch, I he asked, he was asking the students what they wanted to do with wet plate, and I was like, well, I want to make a 4 by 5 foot plate out of with a delivery truck, and he just kind of took me to the side, and he has this really stern voice, and he's pretty matter of fact, and he's like, Ian, I don't want to crush your dreams, but what you're describing to me is sounds impossible, and I was inside, I like halfway died, but I was kind of laughing because I'm like, I didn't say it to him, but I'm like, I already bought the truck, and I have a huge lens, and I'm kind of in it, and I didn't know anything about wet plate. As time went on, he left that door and that means of communication open. So as I started kept progressing, I would just kind of talk to him a little bit here and there, and then through that process, we became pretty friendly, and he was always there for me. I mean, he was more than an encourager. He was so instrumental in all the back end, the wet plate, the like the science and the chemistry, and he knew so much about it that even though he kind of understood what I was doing, but I could tell him things, and I mean, just telling him I wanted to make a plate that big after we were talking for a while, he made me a new collodion formula. He's like, I'll try this, and that was just the start of it. But
He
yeah.
was teaching quite regularly, about every 2 months, 3 students here, 4 students there. And he was saying the same thing over and over. And one day I said, you kind of need to write a book. And so we started writing this book for his teaching process. And he's like, well, how do you do that? And I was teaching at university by then. So we just started to write it based on sort of collodion for dummies. And it started out as I think it started out as like a 10-step process, and I think it ended up being 16 steps. But it was something that came because students were asking for it.
So being dyslexic and, not, just having hard time. I always had a hard time reading textbooks and manuals. Like they're very dry for me. You know what I'm saying? Like I get bored with them.
Yeah.
I want to, as an artist, I'm really just whatever. I don't. But Will's book is a very easy read. It's not like the Silver Sunbeam where you read it and you're just like, oh well, like I can't.
Well, I mean, it's definitely a confusing manual, that Silver Sunbeam, right? I mean, you've got to have some background or experience to be able to negotiate through some of the steps there that it presents.
So I've told people this who ask me, hey, what workbook should I get? Will's book, his workbook, I want to say it's a very 101 manual. Like it's very easy to understand. It has the 16 steps, and if you follow those steps, you'll be able to make plates. The thing about his manual too, though, is he gets really deep into, okay, I want you to make your collodion. I want you to make your varnish. And he wanted people to really have an understanding of this process, not just being stuck in textbooks, not being stuck in a, like a college level course or something. Like you have other manuals that are, PhD manuals or, but his workshop, his class was this is what you need to do to get it done.
Yeah.
And that's how Will was. Will was a very like, what do you need to get done, and let's do it. Like he was also a very romantic person. I mean, like very much like the things he saw were very complex. But like when it came to teaching this, he had his way that he taught, and he's like, don't vary from it. Just here's what it is, and this is how it works.
Yeah.
And it worked for him, and it's really worked for me too. I there's times I'll look at something, and if I read his book, I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot that. And after I took his workbook with the book, The Ferrotype and How to Make It by Estabrook, that was the next step.
First, he would self-print would teach the classes. There would be a ton of notes that the students would keep. There's typos in every single draft, unfortunately, because that's how it is when you're editing your own work. And then we would add additional stuff and add more resources and add where people could get the equipment they needed and which new chemical company was going to be allowing these students to get the gear that they needed. And it just took off. And so he started using that 16 steps to the collodion plate, and it was a hit. Every student that came to his workshop was given a copy, and then they would vividly take notes throughout the weekend with it. And that was very, very important to him, to have folks have something that they had the tangible recipes in their hand. How do you get yourself out of a box? Well, this were the recipes. This was how to make the chemistry. What a lot of the workshops were doing when Will started was they would hand these folks, all of these chemicals that you purchased from wherever, and then they would mix all of these chemicals on plates and wonder why the students couldn't figure it out. Or, a chemical from store A and a fixer from store B, and, but we're going to mix the powder from, this area C, and, things were catastrophic. So he got a lot of students that had already paid a very large amount of money to take a workshop that they were told and taught how to pour chemicals on a plate, but not how to make the chemicals, or how to clean the plates proper, or how to set it up, or the timing. So Will always wanted people to be able to keep this process going without him. He envisioned that someday, 100 years down the road, a book would be found that told somebody how to make this process, and they would go find all these old chemicals and they would be able to pick it up from scratch. That was his vision.
Yeah. And that instruction manual that you're talking about, is that something that is still available today for folks to research?
After Will passed, there was a person by the name of Milan who was very, very good to Will, and that is where Will sold the books online through one of the collodion international sites, and sold a lot of copies internationally that way. They are the ones that host Will's obituary and a lot of Will's landscape images. And I gave them the rights to give that book to anybody who ever wanted it, because Will was about perpetuating the life of this process. It was never about money. It was never about fortune. It was about keeping this process alive and allowing anybody who ever wanted it to do it. And I just felt that was the right thing to do in his honor, was to give this information away so somebody else someday could learn it.
Yeah, that's a great gift to the community. And I think that the site that you're talking about is alternativephotography.com. Correct. And I think if you go there and search for Will Dunniway, you will find a write-up on his obituary. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there will be a link there that I think you can get to the manual. It's called The Wet Collodion Plate, 16 Steps to Making the Plates.
It should be PDF and available, yes.
Perfect. Very good. What's a funny story that you could share about your time with Will?
I guess one of my funnest times is I ended up assisting them for all of their military reenactment stuff that they did. And Will and all his buddies, they're like old car guys, but for cameras. So everything had to be done just like it was in the 1800s. And so we would do these Civil War reenactments and dress up in the Holly Hobby dresses, and they would have all their gear on. And we had to sleep on hay in our tent that was propped up with sticks. And I, not being a Civil War reenactor, the guns would go off, and every time they would shoot him, I would just hit to the ground, like just duck, feeling like a big explosion going off. And I hit the ground one time, and I think I took out a stick and took down half of the fence, and Will just chuckled and thought it was the funniest thing, and I still have PTSD from those things going off.
Nice.
He was a
Nice.
good guy, though.
Yeah. Conrad, tell me maybe a funny or a personal story or experience that you got to share with Will.
Yeah, I would talk to Will like probably 3 times a week, 4 times a week. Like he'd call me, I'd call him, and we'd just sit and chat. And I'd go up to Yosemite and go visit him and stay at his and Fran's house, and just enjoy dinner, enjoy the darkroom, and his just being around Will and Fran and just enjoying life. And one time I had a shoot in Fresno. And from Fresno to San Diego is like a 5-6 hour drive. And so I just turned and drove the hour and a half up, or hour, whatever it is, to Will's house and spent the night, and, and had breakfast that next morning. And it was just we just ate breakfast and chatted and talked. And, that was actually the last time I saw him alive, and it was like right before, COVID, and it was just a very fun breakfast. And then I packed up around 1 o'clock and drove home. It's just how Will was. He'd always talk about the fun things he's done in life, and his Marine time, and his just the different parts of his life, his career, the things he wanted to do with life. And he talked about his kids and his wife, and I talked about my kids and wife and what I was doing, and it was always, a fun time. We'd talk about, historical things, talk about like all the loops he had, all the lenses, why one lens would be better than the other. I do have a story like the week after I learned wet plate. I went up for a couple of weeks, whatever month, whatever it was, I forget. Time goes by quick nowadays. I went up to his place because my silver had got a lot of garbage in it and it wasn't working anymore. And he showed me how to clean it. And it was the day after Will had worked with National Geographic when he was talking about that Billy the Kid image, the croquet one. And they had this big portrait of it laid out, and the actual, tintypes were still there. And it was very interesting to see those, and to see how much excitement he had, about a historical image, or any image, like, that was historical. Like, that's how he saw this, was that part of history that we're able to touch. And I mean, like Fran told me something, like last time I saw her, she was saying how, like, we only hold on and take care of the things that we have, because after we die, those things are passed on to the next person, whether it's like a lens, a daguerreotype, a wet plate collodion image. Like, we're only the protectors of those for the next generation, so they don't end up in the trash. And I think that really was what Will was doing. He wanted to preserve history.
So, Fran, if there was one thing that you wish that people knew about Will in his life, what would it be?
That he was so proud to have been able to master the process and teach others how to master it. His greatest work, he thought, was the Native American collection that he did when it was sent to Washington, D.C. and the Smithsonian so that we could copyright the images. They said, you can't copyright somebody else's work. And so Will had sent the digital copies of the work he made, and folks in Smithsonian were blown away. I think Will was so humble. I would want people to know what incredible work he did and how beautiful his landscapes are and how much he appreciated that somebody would go to work and spend hard-earned money to to buy one of his landscapes. He was always blown away when one of his prints sold. He just couldn't imagine people paying good money for his work. And I think people don't know that about him.
So, Lisa, tell me, how was it that Will really changed the trajectory of your photographic experience?
I think in a lot of ways his passion for the history of it, and he was such an amazing artist himself, and his plates were always so moving, almost like a time machine where you could step back into it. And he definitely photographed the soul and was able to tell a story with just one picture. And I think that always reminds me is you can tell any story with just one picture. And then the magic of all the chemistry coming together with the lighting and the right moment, and it's exciting, and it feels like you're in this time machine, but yet you're in the present future so many years later. And then his love for all the equipment. I mean, I have a camera that's 150 years old and lenses from the 1860s, and it's like, how did that piece of equipment get to be in my hands, and now I get to make the magic with that?
Yeah, that's great. For people such as myself who never really had the chance to meet or interact with Will very much, what is it that you would like for people to know about Will and what kind of a person that he was?
He was a humble, kind, loving individual who was happy to share any knowledge he had with anyone and make you feel as you were part of the family, and just almost like passing the stick of Stoke onto anybody. It's very warm, inviting, and just a plethora of information, and always willing to pick up the phone and answer any question at any time if you were in the middle of something. I was very, very fortunate to be taught by such a great man and a great artist.
He was such an incredibly generous, giving man. And he would teach folks how to do collodion, and then he owned them for life, is what he felt. He felt it was his responsibility that if somebody got themselves into a box, he would make chemistry in the middle of the night and airship it to them so that they could finish their shoot. He would loan them cameras so that they made sure that they had what they needed to get their job done. He would have people send images of what their plates that they were making, and he would critique them with the most gentle words, but truthful. You know, he would tell somebody, what do you think of my plate? Well, keep it out of the cat box. You know, if it had scratches on them. Well, people don't want to hear that, especially if the cat scratches were intentional.
Yeah.
But Will was a realist. He loved the flowing of the soft edges. He didn't want to see the images ruined in what he thought was ruin. And it's artistic, and I understand that. But he liked the purity of the process and the capturing of the beautiful images along the coast of the Pacific Grove or a beautiful waterfall. He didn't want to see the icky stuff in there, the fingerprints and the smudges. He liked the beauty of the perfect image. And that was, to his credit, it was also probably to other people didn't find the same passion for that. But people need to know that he was a beautiful, humble artist. And though he was only high school educated, he knew a lot more about the collodion process because he had done the field work for well over 35 years and had worked himself out of a box and out of a dust cloud and out of a rainstorm and out of a heat storm over and over and over again, to the point where he could identify a mistake on a plate from a student sending it as a scanned copy. And he did that at all hours of the day or night. He'd get a text message at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm on a shoot. Can you look at my plate? I don't know what this flare is. And he would say, adjust this and check this and fix this. And you got a light leak and try this. And, you know, he could just figure it out because he had done it. As he said, he made all the mistakes himself. And because he was learning and making the mistakes himself and trying to get a hold of John Coffer to say, what did I do? He had to figure it out. When you got, 80 people lined up to have images made and you're by yourself, they don't want a lousy image. He learned very quickly. He had to learn how to do it well. And it was trial and error. And he always called collodion his mistress. She will beat you up all day long, but man, you have a good time at night.
The most valuable thing about him was more his personality. That he was, I don't know how to say it, maybe he was like a man's man. So he's really stern on his beliefs, and he wouldn't really back down from them, either one way or the other. If you challenged him, he'd come at you. But then on the other hand, he was super kind, and he had like a really high sense of morality, and that I really appreciated. And then, of course, he knew the wet plate because he had done it for I don't even know, must have been 30 years, But I just gained so much from him. It was almost I don't know, like it was meant to be that I met him because it was so instrumental in what I went on to do with wet plate. So yeah, I can't say enough good things about him.
In the midst of COVID during 2020 and 2021, Will's health was declining. I asked Ian Reuter about the last time that he spoke to Will.
His health was kind of declining, or is definitely declining. And I was talking to him and I was like, well, I'm going to come visit you. And he was like, yeah, let's whatever. And then Frances is like, it's not a good time because of COVID. If he got sick, that would be a done deal. So she's all we got to wait. And then within that time, I just didn't get to see him again. I almost felt like the last time I talked to him on the phone, I was saying goodbye, So that was really unfortunate because I was ready to get in the car and drive. Like, I was like, oh, you're not doing well. I'm going to come see you like tonight. So that was unfortunate.
On April 8th, 2021, at the age of 74, Will Dunniway passed away in Fresno, California. I asked Conrad and Ian to share the impact of them upon hearing the news of Will's passing. It sounds like Will was a big impact on you. How did hearing about that he was no longer going to be that tangible resource for you to reach out to?
When I would talk to Will, a lot of times I'd be sitting in my garden, just waiting or, talking to him, workshop or my dark room, my studio, wherever. But I talked to him the week before he died, and I think Fran called me and told me, or maybe it was Lisa Dodge who called me. I forget. I mean, it was such a blow, but I just remember being on the phone, just sitting there thinking like, crap, my friend's gone. You know what I'm saying? Like how we all feel when, someone we care about dies, like, who am I going to, for me, like with my grandparents, I would talk to them every day. Every day I would call them up and spend about a half hour to an hour talking to them. And with Will, it was kind of the same way. Like I would talk to him a lot, and it sucked. Like when you lose a friend, it sucks. The hard part for me was that next day I had a pop up, and it's like, wait, I don't have someone I can text my pictures to and, talk about wet plate and have fun and, just enjoy, there was a large hole in my, left from Will.
There's almost a challenge there for those of us in this community to make sure that Will's legacy is not forgotten, but then also to expand on it, right? And to be that resource, to be that mentor to other people that are coming into the craft, to make sure that we continue on with the things that were important to Will.
Yes, and that's something Fran had asked me. Like, she said, Conrad, you need to continue on with this and the way Will was teaching people, and don't let this be lost. That was what he loved, and truly, that is what he loved. You know what I mean? He loved teaching people. He loved showing, us newbies how to do something. And then when he loved it when they would turn and know what to do and how to do it and become, actually be someone who could hold the candle, and as like I remember years back in college in anthropology courses, we would talk about how America and our civilization today has lost the mentor mentee, where like people aren't teaching their children their trades and crafts anymore.
Yeah.
But wet plate is that kind of craft. Wet plate, yes, you can go watch a YouTube manual, but you're still learning from someone. Yes, you can read a book, but when you sit down, watch someone do it, it clicks a lot better. For me anyway, it's a better way to learn. And by helping guide the next generation of wet platers, that's how this craft isn't lost, and that's also how people's memories aren't lost, by telling the stories of people.
Yeah, it was hard. I have a really weird relationship with deaths because I think I've had an extraordinary amount of people that were very close to me pass away. So they always hit me different, but with him, it's just like every time I'm making plates or working with the process, I talk to him. And it's been years now. I talk to him all the time. I'm like, hey, Will, what do you think about this and that? So I still talk to him. Yeah, his death impacted me, but it also he's not gone from me because he's inside of me. So yeah, he'll be here forever with me. I mean, he really was that instrumental in my journey. I just hope his legacy goes on, but it goes on through me. And then you think of all the other people that he literally taught and touched and changed their lives. So hopefully we're testaments to him. I mean, any chance I get to say a good word about him or to say something good about his work or him as a human being, I'm the first one to do it.
And finally, John Coffer recalls the time after Will's death in the memorial that they set up at Camp Tintype.
We had a little memorial set up here. I did anyway at the Jamboree the year he died, and I wanted to let people know, that I have original plates he shot and such, and I wanted to show as much as I could to the new people coming into the process. They need to know who came before and appreciate that.
Right.
Bob Zabel was here that year too. He and Will became real good tight friends, and he would assist Will at workshops and all kinds of stuff. They were the first to shoot wet plate at Yosemite, in modern times.
Well, Fran, I want to thank you for sharing a little bit of a glimpse into Will's life and his legacy. Where can people go to learn more about Will and his work, maybe see some of his images that he was able to create?
I think the alternative photographic site is by far the best. They were very, very generous and let me write an obituary that summarized who Will was as an artist and a man. And they have graciously put a whole bunch of his images up there. And, many of them are prints. Prints are available through me, fran@dunniway.com. I have taken down Will's website because I can't, in my professional world, manage everything. And it's just trying to figure out homes for glass negatives. If anybody has an idea, I would love them to reach out and get a hold of me, because I don't want these glass images broken. And I don't know what's going to happen when something happens to me, because they really do deserve to be on display. They really do deserve to be kept. There's a lot of information on these glass negatives, and they're just beautiful works of art.
That's amazing. Well, thanks again, Fran, for being on the podcast, and hopefully you'll hear from some folks that might have some ideas on what to do with some of Will's work and how we can help to maintain his legacy.
I would appreciate anybody reaching out. That would be amazing.
Great.
And I really appreciate your interest in helping me to keep this man's legacy alive.
No, thank you. Thanks, Fran. I'd like to thank all of my guests who were able to share stories about Will with those of us who didn't know him. I'd also like to challenge everyone listening that shoots a collodion plate over the next few weeks and posts it online to tag it with hashtag Will Dunniway. Maybe this will prompt others to seek out Will's photos and not only learn more about him, but stand as a testament to his legacy and impact on the community. So how do we close? How about a few words from the man himself, Will Dunniway, at one of his classroom sessions before he passed?
But the thing we have in common here is that we all love photography, and we all love silver, and we love light. And we want to use those tools to make pictures however you see them with your own eye, with this incredibly hand-on process. I basically was an art director for 35 years, and I learned photography by being frustrated by photographers that I couldn't control in photo illustrations. So I just said, give me the Nikon and show me what an f-stop is. And back in the 1960s, and I learned photography just by doing it. I'm only a high school graduate. I'm not a teacher. I've spent my life in art as a designer and as a photographer. So my credentials are here is I have 20 years in the field, not in a studio per se, but in the field, working with this process. I used to do Civil War reenactments. That's the way I made my living. Extra money when I was art director, and it was good money. But I'm finding, I had a full 32 feet of canvas to set up, and it was really hard for me. But it really was a way to learn, because I had to produce portraits consistently all day, every day. And I was just making money. And so it was a good way to teach myself. But now that I'm getting older and people tend to want to know what I know, I'm starting to teach workshops, and thus I designed this manual and kind of entered into a new phase of my life of becoming the old guy in the business. In this business, I am the old guy. There's only a handful of us left that have been working like this many years in the process. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of new people. But you are entering into a very select crowd here worldwide. There's probably there's less than 1,000 people in the world that know this process. And when you're speaking worldwide, that's a very small crowd. If you read the names of some of the people, most all of them are my friends. It's a small world. And welcome to it. But there's dues to pay, and the payment will be as you go along this week. You'll begin to see some of the problems. I can't even tell you where we'll get an image today or tomorrow. There may be problems from the get-go, and it may be a perfect week. We just have to start and see how it works. Because there's a whole new set of organic chemistry there that I'm not controlling. It came from another source. So we have to mix up the stuff and hope that it works. It doesn't always work. There's 1,000 things that can go wrong, but mostly it works. And if it doesn't, usually I've got another card up my sleeve to make it work. My reference point, as I first said, in collodion has always been historic. I learned to love photography. I saw the early books. My mother realized that when I was very young that I liked history. But I was an artist. And I found there was a good marriage between the art of photography and the historical photography. It gave me a marriage, if you may, between an old process that I used to look at the Civil War pictures of Brady, Sullivan, Gibson, Gardner, And I used to see these pictures of these guys with these big old box cameras and hauling them around and setting up tents and wagons and their what is it stuff. And it was like, that's what I wanted to do. It took me 40 years to do it, but I finally, when I did it, I knew that I had reached into an area of my life that was what I was going to be.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode and maybe even picked up some insights that will help you along in your own wet play journey. I'd love to hear from you on who you'd like to have on in a future episode. So send me a message and follow our Instagram account at 10 questions with any feedback. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast provider. Thanks for listening to me, Chad Shryock, and my expert guests, and I look forward to you joining me again in the coming weeks for a new episode of 10 Questions.